Welcome back. Now, internal fraud can jeopardize your entire business. This workshop will be looking at strategies to safeguard your operations, spot the red flags, implement controls, and encourage whole team accountability. Led by Marc Evans, who's the co-founder of Fraud Hero. He's a financial crimes detective, a task force officer with the US Secret Service, and a certified fraud examiner. And for the past 6 years, he's exclusively investigated financial and fraud crimes. Welcome, Marc. Thanks very much for joining us.
Make sure you can hear me. Well, thank you for having me, Sue. I really appreciate it. I want to make sure, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good over there? Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And I want to thank IFL again for having me. It's always a joy to come back. Um, I'm probably going to be reiterating quite a bit of what Dan shared. So, so this would be great. But I'm going to give this perspective kind of from the fraud, from the detective and criminal standpoint. So I think this will be interesting. So hello, everyone. Like Sue said, my name is Marc Evans. I'm the co-founder of Fraud Hero. I've investigated quite a bit of internal fraud. That's one of the main types of fraud that I've actually come across, embezzlement, especially check fraud, things of that nature. And I've been with law enforcement for 13 years. I've investigated fraud crimes for the past 6 years. And starting next week, I'll actually be starting to investigate cyber fraud investigations as well. So adding to the repertoire. But I want to get started here and go over this presentation, which I titled Inside Job. So I'm going to talk to you about detecting and preventing some employee fraud, and I'm going to give you a couple of case studies on some cases that I've actually investigated myself and to be able to lay out exactly how these things happen. So the first thing I want to do is we're going to discuss understanding internal fraud and exactly what it is. And it'll help you recognize some potential risk and vulnerabilities when it comes to this. And then you're going to recognize some red flags. I'm going to give you some that maybe you haven't seen before. Dan did a great job right before me. I'm going to be reiterating quite a bit of what he talked about when it comes to recognizing these schemes. And then some actionable strategies. Dan gave a lot of the actionable strategies that you're probably going to deal with. But I'm just going to give you some from the investigative standpoint, from a criminal investigation that I've been able to carry out. And I probably won't take up too much of your time because I don't want to beat a dead horse when it comes to what Dan said as well. So I want to talk about the impact of internal fraud. So internal fraud definitely leads to significant financial losses, also reputational losses within the business. In my experience, and this comes from stats as well with the ACFE and some other organizations where the average loss for internal fraud is $60,000. And that's not the revenue loss of the business. That's actually the physical financial loss that that person will end up stealing from the company. And this increases with higher positions. Now, I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada, and we have a lot of high-ranking positions here, especially with our casinos, which are multi-billion-dollar corporations. And I'm going to go over one case that actually involves a casino, and you'll see that sometimes these cases can go upwards of 500,000 to a million and more. The average time that I've discovered before the internal fraud is actually discovered is 18 months. Now, the time frame that it takes place is one thing. So it could take place around 12 months, but before the actual business discovers that they've been a victim of an internal fraud is around 18 months. Sometimes it goes longer. The longest that I've actually seen a case go where the business wasn't aware the fraud was happening was 10 years. So that led to quite a bit of a loss and some reputational damage, unfortunately, but where they had to try to reel that back in. Some of the most common forms of fraud that I've seen that I've investigated, the fake vendors. I've seen a lot of that ghost invoices where the bookkeeper or accounting is creating fake invoices. They're using different things like with Intuit and some of the other systems that are being used to to create these invoices. Sometimes people don't have the actual like computer system invoices. I've seen paper invoices that are also faked as well. Check tampering. I know in the UK you don't use checks as much as we do in the US, and I wish the US would get on board um, with reducing the amount of checks that we see. But check tampering is probably one of the most common forms of internal fraud that I see just here in the States because it's still so commonly used for vendor payments. Um, so hopefully that'll change at some point. ACH and wire transfers, I do see that quite a bit. Unfortunately, still not as much as check tampering here in the States, but that is definitely picking up. I do see larger amounts taken when wire transfers do occur, though. And then personal purchases on company accounts. Now, a lot of companies will give their employees, sometimes their higher ranking employees, access to a credit card or something similar. And this employee, with internal frauds, they normally start very small. And it'll start with maybe a couple $100 here. And they realize, you know what? No one noticed. And I'm going to try to push it a little more. And it goes more and more until they're actually caught. And by the time they're caught, they're doing 10 to 20 times the amount they were taking initially. And I'm going to give you a very specific example of how that happens. One other form of fraud that I've seen that will affect AP is mail theft. And that comes in a form of someone maybe redirecting mail. I think the most I've seen and that one is around $2 million, and that happened within a matter of like a month. So, so that was fairly quick. So let me go forward here. All right. So what is internal fraud? So it involves dishonest activities executed by employees, impacting the organization's integrity and financial health. Internal frauds have a much bigger impact than external fraud because the person that you believe is supposed to be protecting your assets is actually taking them from you. And that can be very detrimental to the company. I've actually even had one company where they were so adamant that the person they trusted the most wasn't the one victimizing them, that they fired every other employee except for the one that was victimizing them. Um, so they can have a very big impact on these companies. Some of the common forms of internal fraud that I see are duplicate payments. I have a case example that I'm going to talk about for duplicate payments, forged invoices and checks, and the misappropriation of funds. Those, like Dan talked about, those are the most common ones. Occupational fraud are huge, but I just get to see it from the criminal side of it and not so much the forensic accounting side of it. Um, that does get pricey, but from a criminal standpoint, we do or from a criminal investigative standpoint, that we do need those forensic audits to help us with our criminal investigation. And sometimes it can get very pricey for the business or corporation. On the impact on the business of internal fraud, you can see significant financial losses and damage to reputation. Sometimes damage to the business's reputation is even worse than the financial losses because once you lose reputation, it's very hard to build that back up. And if you don't build it back up, now you're losing revenue on top of the financial losses that you already incurred. So very important to make sure you take care of that part of it. And then addressing internal fraud is crucial for maintaining strong internal controls and protecting your organizational resources. Um, I know some companies, they don't want to talk about it because they feel if they talk about it, that means it's happening. And that's not the case. The more you talk about it, you're probably going to reduce the amount that it could actually happen because more people are aware that it could happen. And the more people who are aware, the less likely they are to commit it because now they know the company, if you do have someone internally stealing, they know the company is looking at these things. And they know it's a higher likelihood that they may get caught if they actually are committing internal fraud. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over, this is the first case study that I'm going to go over. And this is a local one, like I said, that I've dealt with. And this is going to highlight how the lack of separation of duties and no internal oversight and led to identity theft of other employees, credit card fraud, and embezzlement. So it was a combination of a lot of different things that this person did. And this guy ended up stealing $105,000. And this company was a painting contracting company. And one of the important lessons to have here is there should be more than one person overseeing all accounts payables and receivables. There was one person in charge of this entire thing. He exploited the system. He had access to work from home, so he had a computer with full-on access, and the business owner had no access to that computer once it was out of the office. So even trying to get that computer back to shut it down was a problem because he couldn't remotely turn it off and he couldn't remotely revoke that person's access. So how this whole thing happened, I think I have it right here. Yep. So here's what happened. So the contracting business, they would pay their employees using these reloadable debit cards for work because sometimes the employees would go out of state and they would work out of state. And so in order to pay them while they're not within the state, they would say, hey, you know what? I'm going to give you these reloadable cards. We'll load them with your weekly checks or biweekly checks, and the payment amount. And then that way you'll have access to your funds while you're doing the work in another state. And so the bookkeeper, what he ended up doing was while those employees were out of state, he would take their personal information and he would make another account in their name. But what he would do is he would add all of his own information to it as well. So it was a combination. He would use their name, date of birth, social security number, all that stuff to open the account and have another reloadable card. Then he would add his address and phone number and his bank account, and he would just transfer the money from the reloadable card straight to his bank account. And since he was the only one able to see it, and he could also do this from home at any time, he would zero out the transaction afterwards. So it looked on the books that there was no payment made. Now, this wasn't discovered until the employees got back and they realized that, wait a minute, I'm being charged double payments because now taxes are coming into play, saying that they're receiving way more money than what they actually received. Um, and some of the employees even were still getting paid by paper check. So once they got back in town, they were no longer getting paid with the reloadable cards. And that flagged in the system saying, wait a minute, why are we still paying reloadable cards if they're getting physical checks to make this payment? So the employees came forward and said, hey, there's an issue going on. The owner had no idea. He had no one to help him. He trusted this person with complete oversight of everything and resulted in a $105,000 loss. So how could this have been prevented? Checks and balances. Having a verification process before payments were sent out would have been huge. Um, and then next is restricting access only to working hours. So this person had access to this system day and night, 24/7. So while people are sleeping, the owner's sleeping, he could be in there manipulating numbers and changing it. So when the owner did actually look at it, it looked as if everything was normal. There was a lot. I'm not a forensic accountant by any means, but I am able to look at numbers and see like, hey, this does not add up. Um, and then enable remote access to a work computer. So if you work for a company or any corporation, the business itself should be able to have remote access to that computer. They should be able to shut out the person who's committing fraud at any time if they are. And this person had the computer. He didn't want to give it up. He actually was trying to reset everything on the computer to try to delete evidence um, before we were able to get it back. And he was living a great life. He had a nice new car. He had a really nice new truck, and collected a lot of money. He even when I interviewed him, he was very adamant that he had done nothing wrong. Now, my interviews are a little bit different than a business interview. So I was able to identify that he was not being forthcoming or truthful and forthcoming with everything. And he ended up, of course, being arrested. And then encourage employees to come forward when suspicious activity is discovered. If it wasn't for the employees coming forward and saying, "Hey, we think something's wrong with this payments," um, the owner may have never known. So, and I think that's one of the biggest things. I know Dan harped on that earlier about having this culture that people are not afraid to come out and say anything. And in this next case study, I'm going to highlight exactly why that could be a problem. So this is another one that I had recently. And this one highlights the lack of monitoring transactions. Um, and this is only discovered because another person who worked at this business or this casino alerted the management and investigation team. Now, so this was at the Aria. This was a fairly large casino here in Las Vegas. And this person was able to steal $773,000 in a matter of 12 months. And one of the biggest glaring red flags in this entire thing was he started living a very lavish lifestyle. And if it wasn't for another manager who thought, wait a minute, we're making the same amount of money. How are you able to afford all of these things that you now have suddenly? But there were no system in place to track the refunds. And the biggest part about this was when I talked to the business, the way he was actually committing this internal fraud, it would have never flagged in their system. So unless that person has said something, he may still be committing this fraud. So what happened? So this person was in charge of doing reservations, and what he would do is after someone would come to the hotel and they would stay for however long. They would come, they would stay, they would leave, they would make their payment, and everything was okay. And they would wait a little while and they would reopen that reservation. And once they reopened the reservation, he would enter his own banking information and then do a refund for that amount. Now, the person who stayed at the hotel was never at a loss. They never lost any money. It didn't come out of their account. It didn't affect them at all. This money came directly from the business. And it wasn't flagging in the system because it looked like it was just a refund for someone who maybe wasn't happy with their stay. Maybe they didn't stay at all, but there was nothing in place to show that this was actually occurring. And then once he would conduct the refund, he did this for 12 months. And a lot of times with internal fraud, they start really small because people are trying to test out and see how they work, right? So what they want to do is they want to see, okay, I'll try 500 bucks, $1,000. And they started out very small until one point it became every transaction was $3,000 to $4,000 at a time. I believe in 3 of the 12 months, he took over $100,000 in each of those months, leading up to a total of $773,000. And I said, this was only discovered when the manager became suspicious of his new lifestyle and says, hey, something is not going right here. I need to let someone else know. So how could this have been prevented? So some kind of notification system, what should have been put in place, or hopefully is now, for the excessive number of refunds that are completed by one person. And that was what the other managers were able to identify when that person looked in the system, like, wait a minute, there's dozens and dozens of refunds a month being done by the same person. And so why is that happening? Like, is there a flaw in our system? Is our business not operating correctly? Is there something that we're not, helping the customers with? So that was something that was out of the norm. Um, Possibly removing the ability to change bank account information without more than one person's approval. So having a checks and balance. If someone's adding or changing account information, that should go through more than one person. To verify that the information is correct, to verify that it's not the same account being used over and over again, and then have a higher frequency of internal audits or maybe surprise audits. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Um, but having those audits of looking at those records, I mean, someone would have seen in a matter of a month, hey, we have uh, this much time or this many transactions within this much time. I think somebody raised their hand, I'm not sure. Oh, we're back. And then encourage employees to come forward. I talked about that quite a bit. The unfortunate thing in this case is, and I didn't agree with it, is this manager came forward and was able to save them a lot of money. What would have happened? But in turn, that manager was also terminated. So that actually surprised me. Um, and the reason why, I'm not sure, but that manager was also terminated, but that manager was not involved in the crime at all. And with this case, Dan mentioned earlier about how sometimes in the justice system things don't pan out as far as restitution and time served. Unfortunately, this person was just recently sentenced, and he was sentenced to 6 months in jail, and then restitution for $773,000. Now, doing the math on that, depending on how much you can actually afford, if he was paying 500 bucks a month, that's going to take him 124 years to pay back that money, which means they're never getting back that money. Even if you double that per on a monthly basis, it'll take 65 years to make that money or make that payment. So for 6 months and stealing that much money, that was uh very difficult. The amount of work that went into it to see that happen. So that's why it's very important also to make sure that our justice system, they're also up to date on these things as well. So what are some red flags and warning signs that you can identify? So recognize an unusual invoice patterns such as duplicates or round numbers. That's a big red flag, especially if you're doing the auditing. It's crucial for detecting fraud. Vendor information inconsistencies. If you can do like vendor management, vendor onboarding, that helps out a lot with this. But if their information is constantly changing, you see fraudulent or errors in there, do a careful review and verification. Make sure that you're paying the right person. Emergency payments. If there's a lot of requests for emergency payments, that should definitely sound some alarms in the financial controls because maybe one or two emergency payments can happen, but if you have them happening all the time, and this now, especially with social engineering and AI happening, are being more potentially used, that's definitely something to be aware of. And then control weaknesses. So lack of segregation of duties is huge. Make sure you have more than one person in place that can help with making these payments. Some best practices that I've seen just from the criminal investigation side. Conducting routine checks and audits are essential. I can't say that enough. Employee training, regular employee training, I think is probably by far the biggest when it comes to any kind of fraud. And it's not just like rate, it's ongoing training as well. Because what happens is you may get some employee turnover. So you may have trained some employees at this point, but now you have a whole new set of employees that haven't had the training at all. And they're more likely to either fall victim to fraud or not be aware of the policies and procedures of how fraud cases are handled and what they need to do. And especially when it comes to reporting. Encourage the reporting of suspicious activities. Foster a culture, like bring a culture about that it's okay for someone to come forward and say, hey, something doesn't seem right without the fear of repercussions. I can't tell you how many employees are afraid to say something because they believe they're going to get in trouble for saying something. So definitely don't want that to be an issue. And then making improvements on internal controls, including the use of AI. AI, like Dan said, has been very helpful. When it comes to these, there's a lot of different programs that are now being built that can help out with this. Like I said, I'm not gonna beat this dead horse too much because like I said, Dan talked a lot about it, but segregation of duties, regular and surprise audits are huge. I said building a training awareness program is going to be big, and then enhancing the approval policies. So enhanced policy related to invoice approval. So it should be more than one person. If you have one person that you believe should be in charge of approving every invoice, you might want to look at that and decide, okay, you know what, maybe we should have one or two more people who actually have to approve invoices, especially for large amounts. And then updating the vendor onboarding process and verifying who your vendors are. I know Dan gave out some tools, but there's software and various types of tools and analytic software that's out there that can help flag suspicious vendors, monitor transaction patterns now, make it much easier. Everyone probably has email phishing tools by now. I think it's built into almost every web or email browser now. Um, Using AI is going to be huge. Oh, I forgot to mention blockchain technology. That is another big thing because it's very hard to manipulate the blockchain. I haven't seen too many cases where the blockchain can be manipulated. I know people think blockchain, they think cryptocurrency, but blockchain can actually be used in banking and mortgages and all different kinds of functions to secure data and data transfer of things. Um, AI-driven monitoring. Things are moving a lot faster. AI does make things a lot easier, but we don't want to wholly rely on AI. You want to make it a part of your overall system. If you just wholly rely on AI, then the critical thinking of the average person will go down and you think, oh, I'll just trust the system to do everything. You still have to check those things to make sure they are correct. So AI is a tool. It's not the end all be all of a lot of these things. And then integration with systems. Uh, I've learned just in my time as being a criminal investigator, I can tell you right now, in police work and detective work, we have a bunch of different databases to utilize to investigate one case. It is a lot easier if you can have systems that work together, so you're not checking three, four, five, or six systems to make sure that something works properly. If you can have an ecosystem that works well, think of something like your cell phones. Apple has an ecosystem. They have iOS, they have iMessage, they have all these different things. The same thing with Android. Android has an ecosystem. Google, Microsoft, all these different companies have ecosystems that work better together effectively. They work more effectively together when they're the same system. So think about implementing something like that. So just to get some key takeaways here, vigilance is key and accounts payable is essential for financial management and fraud prevention. Recognizing red flags. If you see something that doesn't look right, say something. Trust your gut. Or if you're getting an information that, hey, you know what, that doesn't quite look right to me, or this person's asking for an emergency payment and this doesn't seem right to me, let me just pause, think about it, and then let me verify this is actually legitimate. And then take a proactive fraud prevention. For some reason, fraud prevention always goes to the back end because companies are more worried about making money than they are about protecting it. Um, but if you protect money in the long run, you're going to probably make more money. So you want to take that proactive approach to make sure that you don't lose in the end. So that is my presentation. I want to thank everyone for having me. These are places where you can reach out to me. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so if you want to find that there, and then you can email me at Marc@FraudHero if you have any questions or follow up. I'll be more than happy to help out.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. That was great. And I guess from your experience, you find out the crimes being committed when some of these other things aren't being done. I think
Oh,
that's a good takeaway.
100%.
Thank you very much
100%.
indeed. Thanks for joining us. That was great.